I think it's hard to argue that the biggest cartoons coming out right now, not based off existing IP, are either indie animation or have roots in indie animation. It kinda sucks to say, but it's starting to feel like mainstream cartoons are kinda cooked. Although I'm confident that things can bounce back, I can't help but wonder, how did this happen? What really got me thinking about this was the announcement that the Amazing Digital Circus was moving forward as a full series. But it's staying indie, with episodes dropping on the Glitch YouTube channel. And on one hand, it's like, yeah, 274 million views? I'd hold on to ownership of this show for as long as I can. But on the other hand, it's 274 million views! That's almost triple the amount of views the Hazbin pilot has. And when that pilot wasn't anywhere near its current view count, you still had studios trying to scoop it up. So with over 200 million views in 4 months, I'd be shocked if they weren't approached by a notable entertainment company interested in buying their show. And yet, even when up against the nightmare that is funding a full season, they stuck to their guns and kept the show in indie production. Although shit, this might be the first indie series to actively pay for itself, I don't know. How did we get to the point where YouTube is a more suitable home for your cartoon than Nick, Disney, Cartoon Network, or a streaming service like Netflix? If you can make it work, that is. I know indie is expensive and not everyone can do it, but yet here we are. I could drive to Little Tokyo right now, check out those pin displays. If you've been there, you know the ones. And I guarantee I'll find a bootleg pin of Pomni or Blitzo. Before Hamster or, damn, can a studio order some more cartoons already? I'm trying to name someone from a show that's either not canceled, not a reboot, or not based off a comic. Join me as we unpack how indie animation replaced mainstream cartoons. Watch Sub-Lo and Tangy Mustard! I'm sick of the games, man! Alright, so I should probably address the elephant in the room before I start my dissertation, which is the fact that, yeah, indie animation is up right now, but that could be because the animation industry is drier than the Sahara Desert. Very little is being made by any of the major studios, and don't quote me on this, but I heard that about 70% of the industry is out of work right now. Which definitely checks out. A lot of industry peeps I follow online have been going through it since the end of 2022. When a lot of shows are either ending or are straight up not getting renewed and thus there's less for fans to talk about, it's easy to point to the animation that is coming out online and claim that it's stolen the crown. But honestly, I think what we're seeing with indie is something that's been slowly building up before the industry even got to this extremely dire state. You'll see what I mean later in the video. I also think it's worth defining what indie animation is, even if it's something I think most of us can figure out. But in the age where the team behind these projects can vary from a one-man band to a small studio with a CEO, the lines can get blurred a bit. To me, indie animation is simply animation that's not produced by a major studio. It's not owned by a corporation. It's animation that can't be found on cable or a streaming service, but good old YouTube. Projects whose continued existence relies on funding from fans, whether that be merch or a Patreon. Is Hazbin indie? The pilot was, but the show itself isn't. It's on Prime and was produced by A24 and Bento Box. Not to mention the show getting picked up was always the plan with Hazbin. It was never meant to be independent forever. Now is Helluva Boss indie? Yeah, that's still produced by only Spindlehorse, and its funding relies on the people. I do think the term indie animation has become a broad umbrella, since I imagine studios like Glitch and Spindlehorse are in a better position than someone who's making a cartoon all by themselves with the help of like 2 or 3 friends. And we should probably be calling it something like the webtoon scene, but the manga site already stole that name. Not all indie series are created equal, but again, animation is expensive, so I don't think something should be disqualified as indie animation just because they were lucky enough to build up the bread necessary to have a good pipeline going. It's still independent at the end of the day. Alright, preamble over. Let's get into it. Some say you shouldn't judge a book by its cover. Well, I say you shouldn't judge a cartoon by its art style. But sadly, people do. A few years back, I talked about the beef viewers had with modern cartoon art styles. Although I rejected the notion that every cartoon from the mid-2010s to early 2020s looked exactly the same, they did share a habit of cutesy, rounder art styles that were kinda simple. And while maintaining designs that are animation-friendly should always be the goal, I'd argue that a lot of studios and a lot of shows started to lose the sauce of it, partially because executives do have a say in the art direction. The team behind the Ben 10 reboot wanted it to look more like anime, while the higher-ups wanted it to look more like Family Guy. And the final result was a really weird in-between that a lot of people who grew up with the original still can't stomach. A lot of these art styles didn't feel like they had a personal identity. Like you couldn't look at Amphibia and say, yup, that's Matt Brawley's style, the same way you could with a show by Gendy, Prynoski, or Elmer. Styles developed by a creator, used in other shows created by them, that's simplified for animation, but still distinctly theirs. I hope this makes sense, but it feels like we went from art style shifting from something that's a part of a creator's brand to something that's more of a network's brand. A lot of Cartoon Network shows in the mid to late 2010s didn't have the exact same art style, but I would say a bulk of those styles feed into each other. They all borrow elements from one another. Or how Amphibia and Big City Greens definitely draw inspiration from Gravity Falls, which is already paying homage to The Simpsons. Or how a lot of Nick's CGI reboots emulate the designs of whatever franchise they're putting a new spin on, but they're rendered in a way that, for lack of a better analogy, looks like they could all be in the same video game? It's no longer about shows resembling one another because they are created by the same person, but because they're a part of the same family tree. This is where indie animation feels like a breath of fresh air. I know Hazbin and Helluva Boss can be divisive to say the least, but those shows are unapologetically Vivzi's art style, which in itself feels like a blend of Powerpuff Girls, Invader Zim, and yeah, maybe a hint of DeviantArt. Not that a website that was meant to host art can have one specific art style, but it's more about a vibe, you know? Artists, please don't kill me. The designs in the Amazing Digital Circus feel like Gooseworks style. Monkey Wrench looks like Zurell's style. Farfetched looks like Ashley's style. So on and so forth. And I think that really does make a huge difference in having these shows stand out not just from each other, but from the rest of the animation landscape in general. They also let the compositors go nuts on these projects, giving the animation some extra flair. Now don't get me wrong, plenty of studio productions have compositors, but I assume the time crunch they're on really hinders them. That they need a bigger window to really elevate the animation that was handed to them. And don't get me wrong, Western animation feels like it's slowly but surely returning to diverse art styles being the status quo. Shows like Invincible Fight Girl, Iyanu, and Gentry Chow come to mind. And the indie shows I mentioned are lucky to be able to look as good as they do because of the hardworking, talented people involved, and just as importantly, the amount of attention and the support they receive. Although y'all could be showing Monkey Wrench a lot more love. I'm trying to see Shrike on a Walmart cereal box. Clearly, art styles aren't the only factor in a show's success, but I truly believe with indie animation, they've gone a very long way in getting people to even click on one of these episodes. I remember a long while back, a YouTuber made a video talking about old and new cartoons from a casual perspective, someone who's not really tuned into the current animation landscape like that. And while they were scrolling through the Cartoon Network YouTube channel, they sincerely questioned how kids are able to differentiate new shows from one another when there's so much overlap between art styles. And honestly, I think from the surface level, that's a valid observation. And I'd wager that a lot of people who watch animation casually probably feel the same way. The people throwing on some South Park before they hit the hay, or watching TV with their kids. Contrary to popular belief, people will watch cartoons at any age, but just like any other show they might watch, it has to look appealing to them. It also factors into why I think anime has been popping off over the last few years. The most popular anime are usually adaptations of manga. Thus, the studios are tasked with emulating the mangaka's art style. Styles that innately stick out from one another. Anime is also balls deep in compositing compared to Western animation. Look at this Demon Slayer fight. I can actually barely see the animator's drawings, help! But art styles aren't the only reason why these web series are taking off more and more. There's also the matter of tone. Most tunes on cable or streaming are often a compromise of what the creator envisions and what the studio views as suitable for their brand. On top of that, there's factors like the S&P, mandated runtimes, and executive notes that can affect just about every episode. For better or worse, you had shows with an ongoing story having to Trojan horse the serialization in because the network wanted it to be episodic through and through. You had school settings shoehorned into the focus so it could be more relatable to kids if that was the target demographic. Of course, there are plenty of shows that wanted to be geared more at teens or young adults, but it was a demographic that technically didn't exist, at least to executives. So you had cartoons that tried to push the envelope to the best of their abilities, but still could only go so far with their tone in darker moments. These are areas where indie animation and other web series excel at, because, as far as I know, they just don't have to deal with any of that. These shows are able to preserve their intended tone and vision. They're able to maintain their own vibe. They don't have to worry about their show not fitting a brand. These shows only seem to be restricted by budget, rather than budget, network mandates, and executive notes. But even then, episodes feel like they're only as long as they need to be, whether that be close to a full half hour or just a handful of minutes. While I'm sure things can still get cut down by pacing or, again, budgetary restrictions, they don't have to worry about fitting perfectly into an 11-minute or 22-minute runtime. I'm sure plenty of people prefer consistent runtimes, but I think it's cool to experiment with that sort of stuff. It's a part of what made Kid Cosmic on Netflix special to me. You could have been strapped in for a damn near 40 minutes, or a clean 10. I just think that works so much better than every episode has to be 22 minutes, even though this one only has like 7 minutes worth of story. So let's try to pad it out, because unless you come up with a fire beast story or think of a really interesting angle, you're gonna have fans complaining that nothing interesting happened into the last 5 minutes. Indie feels like it has more freedom to be either completely episodic, completely serialized, or somewhere in the middle. I love that shit when it comes to storytelling. Monkey Wrench has the vibes of a 90s space western anime a la Outlaw Star, where although every episode has its own identity, there's still a clear-cut narrative that advances with each one, leaving us off on a to be continued each time. Helluva Boss seems to embrace that pseudo-serialized approach to storytelling that was popularized in the 2010s. Steven Universe, Adventure Time, Gravity Falls, you know the vibes. There's clearly a bigger picture it's working up to, but it's a lot easier for a casual viewer to catch a random episode without being completely lost. It's a smart way to hook someone in with just one episode, so they'll be enticed to go back and blitz through all of them. Though, like those aforementioned 2010 shows, it comes at the price of fans getting pissed off that a certain plot point isn't advancing, or that the show is prioritizing one thread over the other. Especially tense when the indie pipeline leads to huge gaps between episodes. It really is just like the 2010s. Though where Helluva Boss differs from those shows is that it doesn't need a bomb or special event to advance the narrative. A storyline can directly continue into the next one. Digital Circus seems like it might also continue the pattern of being a little episodic and a little serialized, judging by the trailer. I would not be surprised at all if every episode was an homage to different computer games, but let's save that speculation for the Digital Circus theory video. Lackadaisy seems like it'll embrace serialization, especially being based off an ongoing webcomic. My bro Tariq's show, Hey, seems like it'll be a much more traditional episodic cartoon as he's leaning into his love for sitcoms. That show's going to rip and be relentlessly funny, by the way. Definitely check it out whenever the pilot's done. I also adore how all of these projects take advantage of the lack of S&P meddling in different ways. Obviously, the characters in Helluva Boss curse like sailors. Probably a bit more excessively than they would have if it was on Adult Swim or something. You have pilots like Hugo's Mind Palace that use profanity pretty sparingly, maintaining a vibe of something geared more towards teens and young adults than the 6 to 11 kids demographic or the 30 and up club. But then something like Digital Circus has it built into the lore that swearing is forbidden in the game. They effectively good placed it, ensuring it's suitable for younger viewers who have definitely already latched onto it from character design alone, and I bet it goes a long way in fighting demonetization. When it comes to the target demographic, the project overall gives me huge Infinity Train vibes, in which anyone of any age can tune in and get something out of it. Part of why I love Digital Circus' refusal to use profanity is that it shows people aren't using the indie scene to make cute yet gritty lore show number 11. But unlike Disney, they can say, oh, fuck! These creatives are truly trying to do their vision justice and push the envelope, creating shows that aren't watered down nor feel like they're overcompensating. they are anything more or less than what they need to be, which is something that does go a long way for viewers, especially older viewers who want more animation catered to them that isn't just sitcoms or anime. If you're on TikTok, you might have seen the trend when the kids show starts acting like a kid show, basically highlighting that it is jarring when a show or movie that hooks in a wider demographic has to remind you of what audience was in mind while making it. And I think it's super fair to want to experience a cartoon without feeling like you're being talked down to or putting up with jokes that would only amuse a first grader. This, in conjunction with everything else, has really given indie a leg up on cable and streaming. But none of these have been the biggest factor in indie success. The biggest one being the most obvious, the fact that these shows are, well, free. Surprise, surprise. Shows are gonna have a lot more viewership when they're way more accessible to the viewer. And a lack of accessibility plays a gigantic role in why everything is such a mess with Western animation right now. The streaming wars messed everything up, and animation took one of the biggest hits. Everything was a lot simpler when we had cable. As long as your household had a basic cable subscription, you had access to most of the good stuff. Measuring a show's success was a lot simpler. Is it pulling in good ratings, and is it selling a lot of merch? But then, everything changed when Netflix attacked. And Hulu, but I think people usually point fingers at only Netflix because not only did they have a good catalog of shows and movies for a cheap price, but they're the first ones who really made originals work. In fact, I'd argue there's a correlation between Netflix cranking out more and more hits and cable viewership declining in the West. I remember 2015 through 2018 being the era where I was watching more Netflix originals than shows on TV. It was the era I saw more people in real life and online talk about cutting the cord. And while Netflix saw record-breaking highs in 2017, cable TV was seeing record-breaking lows. This in itself was already a problem, as if you missed a new episode of your favorite show, just about every TV channel offered said episode online the next day, as long as you had a cable login. With a good bulk of these shows, especially of the animated variety, not having full seasons hit streaming until months, if not years after they aired on TV. So fans of these series who no longer had cable were left scavenging the internet for downloads or Kiss Cartoon Mirrors to get their fix. It was brutal. All the while, viewership of these shows on cable dwindled more and more. Shows going from at least 1 million viewers per episode to 900K, 700K, 500K, and so on. By the time we reached shows like The Owl House and Amphibia, their cable premieres would hit like 300,000 viewers, and higher-ups considered that a success. A clear yet baffling demonstration of how much has changed in only a few years. Especially because the internet made it obvious that these shows were being viewed by millions of people. And of course, as we entered the 2020s, every entertainment company wanted their own Netflix. Now new shows were scattered across a dozen streaming services. But like, most people were fine with just sticking to Netflix. And a lot of these streaming exclusive shows wouldn't be distributed internationally if that platform hadn't launched in other regions. So between shows that still premiered on cable but only raking in a fraction of the views, shows locked behind a paywall, and shows just not being made as accessible as they once were, it became like really hard for studios to gauge what actually qualifies as a success, which has factored into less shows being made and popular IP dominating with reboots at every corner. This is really where indie animation has stolen the spotlight, because 99.9% of the time, these shows are just on YouTube. The only thing required is an internet connection. And it's painfully obvious that the masses still have an appetite for animation that's not just anime. Helluva Boss being an easy go-to example, as almost every episode averages tens of millions of views. I cannot stress enough, accessibility is key. And while Hazbin is definitely an outlier and not the standard, it shows that this kind of success is still possible for animation, period. No ifs, ands, or buts. Lackadaisy, 13 million views on the pilot. Murder Drones, tens of millions of views on the few episodes available. If you have something that could have been a hit on cable in its heyday, it has the potential to make waves today. It just needs the ability to truly reach the target audience. Watch Monkey Wrench, watch Sublo, watch Monkey Wrench, watch Sublo! Are you hypnotized yet? Studios just have to adapt and work out a much better system. Circling back to The Owl House, the episodes they do have available on YouTube have millions of views. Now sure, animation is expensive, and ad revenue alone cannot pay for everything. But that's why a lot of these indie projects fall back on merch. Merch. Something that seems like a lost art to these studios. The most successful indie projects seem to really understand that what they're making needs that audience support to survive. But they can't ask for that support and make the viewer jump through hoops just to watch it. It's not a perfect system. Indie projects really have to worry about not having enough viewers showing up, or not enough viewers buying merch, or not enough viewers pledging to their Patreon. And going up against that algorithm is never easy. But this accessibility has definitely gone a much longer way in building up momentum for the scene and huge fan bases for these shows. To really put it all into perspective, the kind of turnout you would expect for a Gravity Falls or Steven Universe panel back in the day at something big like Comic-Con is now happening at much smaller cons for indie shows like Helluva Boss. The game has indisputably changed. And I think all that talk of merch, patrons, and panels brings me to my last point. A big reason why I think a lot of the newer hits in animation come from the indie scene is because you, the viewer, have a lot more control in its future. It's been a rough few years to be a fan of Western animation, mainly because of everything I just mentioned. Since like 2019, anytime there was an animated series that curated a large following, especially those that had a Last Airbender, Steven Universe kind of appeal, you know, overarching story, lovable cast of characters, deepest lore, so on and so forth, they never felt long for this world. Ironically, it felt like the more popular a series was, the more likely it was to die. But really, I just think that's because when more people are paying attention, the harder it is for higher-ups to get away with their shitty practices. It's harder to get rid of the body when you're in a room full of eyewitnesses who spent the last hour going, "Yo, I think that guy's about to kill you." It's been exhausting. A brand new show. Gotta make sure to watch it on streaming, get it trending on Twitter, and do just about whatever I can to support it. Except buy merch, cause, you know, they don't make them. And pretty much every single time this has happened, every single time the crew behind a show has made it clear that its future is in danger, there's never been a happy ending. The show just dies all the same. Although, obviously I'm grateful when those shows are able to wrap up with a concrete ending instead of being left on a cliffhanger. Still, I think cable and streaming has burned a lot of animation fans. It's a losing battle to get invested, unlike indie, because again, these shows rely on fan support. Whether that's simply tuning in, pledging to a Kickstarter or Patreon, buying merch, or just spreading the word about it. The viewer has way more control of the show's fate than ever before. And after being burned so many times, I imagine it's a worthwhile investment when the web series you support from day one blows up and has not only cultivated a huge audience, but is now putting out a full-length season over the course of a year or two. I'm sure it doesn't help when it comes to parasocial relationships and people treating any animation as a competition instead of a community effort. It's not meant to be a contest on who can make the best show. It's supposed to be a giant virtual art exhibit where every piece on display is a meaningful collaboration between artists. Indie animation isn't easy to pull off. It's not the answer to the broken state of the industry, but I do think it can light a fire under the collective asses of executives and CEOs who champion established IP over original ideas. Hopefully, the unfathomable amount of views on these projects remind them that although new ideas are risky, they're still worth pursuing, bringing us to a place where indie animation can thrive alongside cartoons produced by major studios, instead of one or the other reigning supreme. Alright, I finally ran out of things to say. So with all that being said, I want to know what you all think. Do you think indie animation has truly dethroned the major studios? Or do you think places like Disney, Nick, and the Ghost of Cartoon Network can bounce back? Let's get a dialogue going in the comments down below. Peep 200 for some dope cartoon merch, and if you haven't already, I would be over the moon if you'd subscribe to the roundtable and hit that like button. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you guys next time. Peace.